Alright, well, we're back again. Today we'll be doing a little video about inks and what ink you should choose. And let me get these out of the way. Just a couple projects I'm working on. Some brush inking. Fun. So, I did a little test, as I always do, get really in depth, with the inks you see here. Not necessarily in this order. So we have your Pilot drafting ink, Kaime drawing ink, Deleter number 3, Higgins Black Magic. This is a Dale & Rowney Simply Black India ink. I'll talk about that ink in a little bit. Speedball Super Black, Eon Vortex, and Icy Comic Super Black. Let's do a little close-up. So if you happen to have an art store that carries some more exotic inks, you'll know what they look like. That's Pilot, Kaime, Deleter number 3, Higgins Black Magic, Speedball Super Black. That's the Dale & Rowney, Eon Vortex, and your Icy Super Black. Alright, so just a little note about the Dale & Rowney. This ink is a pretty rare item, and by that I mean the only place I've ever seen it is at Walmart. Just a little note about this ink for beginners. This isn't a bad ink. It's a little on the thicker side. It tends to not flow the best out of all the inks, and the cap's on a little crooked. It also it's one of the longer drying inks that I have. It takes a while to dry. I can't talk tonight. It takes a while to dry, and but oddly enough, when you're drawing with it, you'll find that because of the thickness and everything of it, you actually have to dip your pen a little bit more frequently than some other inks. But for all intents and purposes, it's actually a pretty black ink. It resists erasing pretty well, and it's not bad for beginners. And if you have a Walmart near you and that's all you have, this is available. So anyway, here's my test sheet. I scored all the inks, and I apologize in advance. It's going to be a pretty long, drawn-out video. But I scored all the inks based upon some various, how like their finish, how will they flow, alcohol and water resistance, how they lay down with a brush and pen. As always, high-resolution scans of this will be available in the description. So pretty much, the inks, the Pilot, pretty much all the inks are going to be roughly 1 fluid ounce, or anywhere between 29.5 and 30 milliliters in volume. The exception to this is the Kaime ink, which is 60 milliliters, and the Speedball Super Black, which is 2 fluid ounces, which is 59.2 milliliters. So I was gonna mark them on price, but I forgot until I sat down to do this video. But going off the top of my head, the Pilot drafting ink is around $9, if I remember correctly. The Kaime ink, I think, is around, I want to say like $11 to $14. Deleter number 3 is around $9. Higgins Black Magic is around $4, I remember. Speedball Super Black is around $6, I believe. The Icy Comic Super Black, I don't know the price of it, and it's almost impossible to find these days. Eon Vortex ink is around between $6 and $9, if I remember correctly. And the Dale & Rowney India ink, I want to say, is around $5 or $6. Try to see to hold this up without disrupting the light. The Pilot drafting ink, the finish is a semi-glossy. Kaime is glossy. Deleter is like a semi-matte. Higgins Black Magic is matte. Speedball Super Black is matte. I mean, the rest are all matte. Now, talking about flow off a pen nib, The Pilot drafting ink is probably it's the thinnest ink. It flows really well off of all the pen nibs I have. You'll see that there's a note. I said that I was getting some weird pigment separation, and it turns out it was this paper had some type of weird, just this sheet, and it had I don't know what's wrong with it, but it was causing the pigment to separate in the Pilot and Kaime ink, more so the Pilot ink. On the next page, you can see right there, the pigment wasn't separating, so I don't know. But it flows the best. It's also the quickest drying ink. The Kaime inks and the Leader inks flow really well. The Kaime is the longest drying ink by far, along with the Daler and Rowney. I actually want to say the Daler and Rowney actually dries slower. The Higgins Black Magic, it flows a little heavy. I think it might be, I'm scared to say that it's too thin. However, I know that it works the best out of technical pens, out of all of these, like Rapidographs. I've used Higgins Black Magic and Rapidographs in the past. Now you do still have to clean them a little bit more than, like a regular technical pen ink. But they reformulated it, and I would imagine it's a little watery, more watery than it used to be, and I would imagine that it probably works better in Rapidographs now. The Black Magic ink was originally formulated for like vellum film and drafting film, not necessarily paper. So, and they did change the formulation. Before, Black Magic was like the go-to ink for comics, but it's not as good as it used to be. The Speedball Super Black flows pretty well. You can get some really thin lines out of it, and you don't have too many issues with it clogging the nibs. The Icy is the same story. It flows really well. You can get thin lines out of it. The Vortex, it cleans. It flows really well. But I actually think this is more of a acrylic. I'm not sure though. I'm not quite sure what type of ink this is. It's manufactured by Ziller, and they do all acrylic. So I imagine it's probably some type of acrylic base. It flows really well, but I noticed that it does clog the nib pretty frequently. You do need to clean your nibs a little bit more often, but it's a really good ink. And actually, when doing solid blacks or brushwork, this stuff lays down so uniformly. It's all your blacks look like one solid black. You can't see any brush strokes or anything like that, which all the other inks you can. And this is the only ink that it's not the darkest, but it's the most opaque. So what I mean by that is if you go over a spot with your brush once, it's going to be the same blackness as if you go over it again. So as you're filling an area, it's very uniform in look. This is probably one of my favorite inks for doing original artwork. It's the most matte out of all the inks as well. As I said, this ink doesn't flow the best, and you have to constantly re-dip and clean your pen with it. It's a pretty thick ink, so it's not that great with flowing, but like I said, it's available at Walmart in their craft section. So if you don't have any art stores like a Michael's or anything near you, this will work. So it's funny that they say this is okay for Rapidographs. I would not use this in Rapidographs. It's way too thick. Alcohol test. You can see here and on the things on the scan, the only ink out of all of these inks that are okay for alcohol tests or for using with alcohol markers is the Kaime. The Speedball Super Black, the Icy, and the Vortex is semi-resistant, meaning if you are very careful not to go over the lines, like one pass with the marker probably won't smudge it too bad. As you can actually see on here, where I went over it multiple times, it actually did smudge a little bit, but the single passes didn't smudge. Also, the ink was only allowed to cure for an hour. I would really recommend, if you're using any of these inks, especially the ones other than the Kaime, even with the Kaime, you want to let your ink dry for 24 hours before you start to use markers or watercolor on them. Now for the water test. all of the inks were waterproof except for the Pilot and Kaime, which you can see there. Those are the only two that resulted in any smudging with the water. So all the other ones were pretty waterproof. I did some brush tests to see how it lays down with a brush. Again, like I said, the Kaime and Pilot were separating for whatever reason on this page. This is what the Pilot looks like when it lays down with a brush. Like I said, it's pretty thin, so you're not going to get a really good black with it. It comes out in more of a gray, and you have to do several washes with it. The Kaime is darker, but again, it's not the best brush ink for filling blacks. If you're doing brush line work, it's passable, definitely. With a pen, again, I did little tests down here. It's really not important. They all flow pretty well. Although it's noted that the Pilot drafting ink can result in the thinnest lines because of how well it flows. The rest are pretty much the same and what type of lines they create, except for the Higgins Black Magic actually flows a little heavy. So the lines that you put down are going to be more bold than the other ones. That's just the way it works. That's been my experience with the new formulation of the ink. Then I did a little, basically going back onto my paper test. I tested to see what inks were compatible with what paper. All the inks pretty much work with all the commonly used paper. The exception is the Deleter number 3 does not work well with the Eon art board or comic board. And the Higgins Black Magic does not work with older Strathmore since they reformulated the ink, and then Strathmore reformulated the paper to work with the inks better. So new Strathmore works well with the Black Magic. However, the new Black Magic doesn't work with the old Strathmore. So if you buy new Strathmore paper, I'd imagine the last couple of years, I think since like 2012 and newer, it'll work fine with the ink. But if you have older ink, I'd imagine it wouldn't work that well with a new paper and vice versa. Okay. Also, it does not work well. The Black Magic does not work well with icy manga manuscript paper, Deleter manga manuscript paper, or the Eon art board. The Higgins Black Magic on the Eon art board is absolutely horrible with bleeding, and Eon specifically states this on their website to not use it with their paper. So everything else worked well with everything else. I did an eraser test here. Don't know how well you'll be able to see it. I used the same order, so from Pilot to the Dell and Rowney. All of them, the inks lifted noticeably with the eraser. The Kaime did exceptionally well, as did the Speedball Super Black. The Black Magic was okay. The Dell and Rowney actually did really well. But the Kaime and Super Black were probably the best for eraser resistance. And I even have here Micron Staedtler pigment liner and the Pentel pigment brush. They all lift. I guess the Staedtler was the best at resistance. Just a little bit better than the Micron. And then the Pentel pigment brush was the worst. I don't use pigment liners that much except for frame borders and architecture, non-man-made things. Here is the Kaime and Pilot with a brush. This page will be scanned to show you what it looks like with a brush. There was no pigment separation on this paper. I didn't fill in the finish section, but the Micron Staedtler and Pentel pigment brush are all matte inks. They all resist alcohol pretty well, and they are all waterproof. And the Micron and Staedtlers work with all the paper I tested, and the Pentel pigment brush works with everything but the Eon board. And with that, I'll say that the Pentel pigment brush, or what's also known as a Fude pen, I'll show you one here on camera. That's these right here. There's two versions of this. One, I think that's a dye-based ink, which has a black cartridge with a gold label, and then the pigment-based ink, which is more like an Indian ink which is the gray cartridge with the silver label. It has a slight bleed, so I would not use it on Eon board for line work. However, it works fine for filling in blacks or doing beta coloring. Those terms mean the same thing. So that's pretty much it. Basically, what it comes down to is no matter what ink you choose to use out of all these, just make sure that it works with the tools you use. There is no right or wrong answer. I have all these inks just for experimentation purposes. You can literally go, and there's other options that I didn't test. Deleter has 6 different inks. They're, varied in purpose. The number 2 ink is not waterproof, and it is extremely resistant against alcohol markers. And that's pretty much the way it works. Most inks that are alcohol resistant are not going to be waterproof, and most waterproof inks are not going to be alcohol resistant. That's just the way it is. Also, I forgot to note, as far as blackness goes, the Kaime ink is pretty black. The Deleter number 3 is extremely black, and so is the number 4. But the number 3 is the darkest ink from Deleter. The super black is pretty black, but let me look at it again. The IC super black, I think it was the darkest ink that I tested. Yeah, by far the darkest ink. The Vortex is pretty black, but by far the Deleter number 3 and the IC super black are the darkest. The Vortex is a little bit lighter, but like I said, it's extremely uniform. So when doing brush inking or filling blacks, this stuff is amazing. It all looks like one shade of black. I mean, that's pretty much it. Like I said, just make sure that your inks match your paper and they work well with your pens and or brushes. And that's really all what it comes down to. And if you plan on, you might have 2 different inks. If you plan on doing no alcohol marker, non-alcohol marker colored illustrations, you can use one ink that's waterproof, and that also allows you to use that ink with watercolor, and then a alcohol resistant ink that is that you'll use for things that are going to be colored with Copics. And that's really all that it comes down to. The most you need is 2 inks for that purpose. There is no one magic ink, however, that you're going to get waterproof, alcohol resistance, and a good black out of. I don't even think you'll get those 2 attributes out of it. Use whatever's available to you. I like Pilot ink for my general purpose stuff. I like faster drying inks. Because you get less smudging on the page. So this is my go-to ink nowadays. This used to be my go-to ink, and if I could get it still, it would be. This stuff, it doesn't dry as quick as the Pilot ink. This is the fastest drying ink, like I said. This stuff is super, super black, and it flows really, really well. I love the look of this ink. But I can't get it anymore. The only way I can get it is by importation from Japan, and it is expensive to do that. You end up paying like 2 to 3 times the price of the ink to have it imported. So this is my go-to ink. All the other inks are just, whatever I feel like using. This ink I have just for when I use Copics, which is not often at all, but it's, large quantity. But you'll get by with any of these inks except for maybe this one. This one's good for beginners though. I rambled on a little too long on this video. I apologize again. But hopefully this enlightens you a little bit on the attributes of different inks and which ink that you'll want to buy. And I know if you buy online, you'll want to know as much about the ink that you're going to spend the money on and have it shipped and wait for and everything. So hopefully this helped you out. Again, if you have any specific questions about anything, or that I haven't touched on any subject, just leave it down below in the comment section, and I'll either answer you directly, or if I think it needs some in-depth answering, I'll make a video about it. All right, have a good night, everybody.